February 14th. It's a day marked by red hearts, nervous handwritten cards, and the innocent cruelty of middle school crushes. It's the one day a year when you ask someone, "Will you be mine?" It's supposed to be safe. In 2008, at E.O. Green Junior High School in Oxnard, California, 15-year-old Larry King asked that question in the school cafeteria. He didn't get a card or a box of chocolates in return. Instead, his simple request for affection triggered a simmering rage in a classmate that would end in an execution during the first period English class. Larry was shot on February 12th, but tragically, poetically, his heart officially stopped beating 2 days later on Valentine's Day. Welcome back to Homicidal Tendency. I'm your host, Matt, and thank you for tuning in today. But before we begin, a necessary warning. Today's episode is deeply distressing and involves children. We will be discussing a hate crime that results in a school shooting and the death of a 15-year-old. This story contains intense themes of homophobia, gender identity based hate, and severe bullying. Please listen with care. I have to be honest with you all. This case we are covering today is a rough one, like I said. It's incredibly sad, frustrating, and deeply complicated. So bear with me if my tone is a little more somber than usual. But I feel it's important to have this story retold and through the shared lens of a fellow queer person. But as we look at the calendar, we're coming up on mid February. We're heading into that season that's filled with red hearts, candy, and expectations of romance. And we're also approaching a very somber anniversary. I realize that you cannot fully tell the story of what happened to Larry King without talking about Valentine's Day. The entire tragedy hinged on that specific date. It was a rejection of a Valentine's gesture that sparked the violence, and it was on Valentine's Day itself that Larry tragically passed away. So, as difficult as the story is, I feel like this is the right time to sit down and really examine what happened at E.O. Green Junior High in February of 2008. Today, we're remembering Larry King. Before we get deep into the narrative, I want to take a moment to talk about names and identity. The victim in this case was 15 years old, and at the time of his death in 2008, he was actively and courageously exploring his gender identity. He wore makeup and heels to school, and he identified as gay to his peers. There is evidence that he was experimenting with different names, including Letitia, in private or online spaces as part of his exploration. Because he was taken so young, we'll never know how his identity would have evolved or what name he would have ultimately chosen for himself. However, in 2008, to his friends, his teacher, and his foster family, he went by Larry. In interviews with people who loved him and supported his self expression, they still called him Larry. Therefore, out of respect for the historical reality of his life at the age of 15, and according and following the lead of the people who knew him best, I will be referring to him as Larry in this episode. I do so with full acknowledgement and respect for the fluid journey of self discovery he was on when he died. To understand Larry at 15, you have to understand the chaotic and traumatic world he was born into. His short life was defined almost entirely by systems: the welfare system, the foster care system, and eventually the educational system. Larry was not a child who fell through the cracks. He was a child who was born into the cracks. Larry King was born in Ventura County, California. His life was defined by profound instability. His biological parents were deeply entrenched in severe drug addiction, primarily methamphetamine. Because of their addiction, Larry's parents were unable to provide even basic care or safety. The environment was characterized by neglect, inconsistency, and exposure to the dangerous realities of drug abuse. Because of the immediate danger, Larry was removed from his biological parents' custody when he was only 2 years old. From age 2 onwards, Larry became a ward of the state. He entered the California foster care system, a system often overwhelmed and under-resourced. For a young child, the most critical development need is secure attachment to a caregiver, knowing that one person will be reliable, will be there. Larry never had that. His early childhood was a revolving door of temporary placements. He was moved from foster home to foster home, never staying long enough to put down roots or to develop a sense of genuine safety. Child psychologists involved in his case later noted that this early chronic instability led to the severe attachment issues. Larry learned early on that adults were unreliable and that love was conditional and temporary. By the time Larry reached school age, the trauma of his infancy and toddlerhood began to manifest behaviorally. He was diagnosed with ADHD and had significant learning disabilities that made a standard classroom setting incredibly difficult for him. He struggled to read and fell behind his peers academically, which only added to his frustration and sense of isolation. More significantly, Larry developed behavioral patterns directly linked to his attachment trauma. He was described by past foster carers and teachers as a child desperately starved for attention. Because he hadn't received positive attention consistently, he learned to seek out any attention he could get, even negative attention. He could be loud, confrontational, and disruptive. Adults often labeled him as a problem child or difficult. In reality, Larry was traumatized and using the only tools he had to force the world to notice him. This dynamic, seeking attention in provocative ways as a survival mechanism, would become tragically relevant in his junior high years. For a significant period during his childhood, Larry was fostered by a couple named Gregory and Don King. They loved Larry deeply and were in the process of formally adopting him. They are the reason his last name was King. This adds a tragic layer to his instability. He wasn't just bouncing around endlessly, he had found a potential forever home. However, as Larry hit puberty, the trauma responses mentioned earlier, the acting out, the confrontational behavior, the intense needs, they became overwhelming. The Kings, despite their love for him, felt ill equipped to manage his escalating behavioral crisis safely in their home. It was a devastating decision for them. They realized he needed residential therapeutic care. This is why he was moved to Casa Pacifica. He didn't go there because nobody wanted him. He went there because the people who wanted him couldn't handle his complex trauma responses. Even while he lived at Casa Pacifica, the Kings remained involved in his life and were still his legal guardians. Don King was the one who had to make the agonizing decision to remove him from life support on Valentine's Day. Casa Pacifica is a residential treatment facility designed specifically for abused, neglected, and severely emotionally disturbed children who cannot thrive in a typical foster home. It was a highly structured environment with therapeutic support. For the first time in his life, Larry had stability. He had a constant bed, constant meals, and staff trained to deal with his trauma. While it was an improvement over the chaos of his early years, living in a group facility still marked him as different with other kids from the junior high school who went home to families every day. Even before he arrived at EO Green Junior High, Larry's identity was beginning to shine through. From a young age, people described Larry as effeminate. He gravitated towards the traditionally things that are associated with girls. In the rough and tumble world of group homes and foster care, this made him a target long before he turned 15. He had been bullied for years for not conforming to the masculine norms. By the time he entered the eighth grade, Larry was no longer just displaying his effeminate traits, he was actively deciding to own them. He began coming out to people as gay. He started wearing accessories like high heeled boots and jewelry, and eventually makeup to school. Given his background of utter powerlessness, being moved around by the state, having no control over his life, his decision to express his gender identity outwardly was perhaps the first autonomous, powerful choice he had made about who he was. It was an act of immense bravery for a kid with his history. This is a difficult but essential nuance to understand his life in the system. Larry was small, he was effeminate, and he was in the group homes with older, tougher boys. He learned very early on that he was a target for physical violence. To survive in these rough environments, Larry developed a specific survival strategy. He would align himself with the toughest, scariest boys in the group home. He would use his wit, his sass, and sometimes flirtation to gain their protection. If he could make the alpha boy laugh or like him, then the other bullies would leave him alone. This is crucial context for what happened to him with Brandon McInerney. When Larry got to EO Green, he likely tried to apply the same survival strategy in a new environment. He identified Brandon as the tough guy, and Larry's experience flirting with or teasing the tough guy was a way to disarm him and gain safety. Tragically, Larry miscalculated. The social rules of junior high school were different than that of a residential group home. Brandon didn't see Larry's behavior as a quirky plea for connection or safety, viewing it through a lens of toxic masculinity and homophobia. Brandon saw it as a mortal insult. It's vital to understand why Larry began dressing so boldly in the months leading up to his death. It wasn't just a whim, it was a desperate reaction to his biology. As Larry hit 15, puberty was hitting him hard. He was growing taller, his voice was deepening, and he was beginning to grow facial hair. According to the teachers and staff at Casa Pacifica, Larry hated these changes. He expressed a deep fear and revulsion towards becoming manly or rugged. He didn't want to look like the adult men he had known in his life. This recontextualizes the makeup and high heels. They weren't just a costume or ways to get attention. They were tools Larry was using to actually fight a war against his own biology. The more testosterone changed his body, the harder he fought back with feminine presentation. It's crucial to understand this is a journey, not a sudden switch that flipped. Larry didn't just show up one day on a Tuesday in full drag. His expression was a slow, steady crescendo that gathered speed into the eighth grade. In the seventh grade, his expression was more subtle. It was in his mannerisms, maybe a swish in his walk, the way he gestured with his hands, and his exclusive preference for female friendships. He was already being bullied for being gay, but the outward visual markers weren't fully there yet. Then the eighth grade comes. The accessories started appearing scarves tied in feminine waves, bracelets, necklaces that came with tailored skinny jeans. Then late January, early February 2008, this is when the crescendo hit its peak. In the final weeks before his death, he began wearing high heeled boots almost daily. And finally, in his very few last days, the full makeup appeared. This timeline shows immense bravery. Every day, he pushed the envelope a little bit further. As the bullying intensified, instead of retreating, Larry dialed up his expression. It was an act of defiance. Every story has visual touchstones. In the story of Larry King, his boots are iconic. He didn't wear dainty dress shoes. His signature items were a pair of brown suede knee high boots with roughly 3-inch stiletto heels. Sounds fierce. These boots were loud on the linoleum floor of the junior high. 3-inch heels make a distinct click clack sound. Before anyone even saw Larry coming down the hallway, they heard him. Wearing those boots wasn't just a fashion choice, it was an auditory announcement of his presence. It forced people to pay attention to him. For a kid who had been invisible in the foster system for years, those boots, they demanded to be seen. The school had a dress code. It was designed in part to minimize gang attire and distractions. Students had to wear collared polos, usually white or blue, and khaki pants or shorts. Larry's genius was in finding the spaces between the rules. The school's dress code, written years before, explicitly forbid things like baggy pants or gang colors, but it did not explicitly forbid boys from wearing makeup or high heels. The administrators who wrote the code simply never imagined a scenario where a boy would want to wear them. Larry was weaponizing the administration's own lack of imagination against them. When teachers told him to take off the heels, he would reportedly challenge them to show him where in the rulebook it said he couldn't wear them. He was intelligent and used the bureaucratic rules to carve out a space for his identity. A common question about this case is, was Larry transgender? Looking back through today's lens, it's easy to see a teenager wearing makeup and high heels who hated the effects of male puberty and assume he was a trans girl at the very beginning of her transition. And today, that might very well be the case. But at 2008, at age 15, Larry was still figuring it out. As we said before, he identified as a gay male and used he, him pronouns. He was just at the beginning of his experimentation with different names in private. Because he was stolen from the world right in the middle of that journey of self discovery, we'll never know for sure how Larry would identify today. The most accurate way to describe him at the time of his death was a brave, gender non-conforming teenager who refused to hide who he was becoming. Now that we spent some time getting to know Larry, we have to talk about the other player in the story. The story of Brandon McInerney is a textbook example of the cycle of violence. If Larry's life was defined by the neglect of the system, Brandon's life was defined by the active, violent chaos of his home. Brandon was born in Ventura, California. His home life was dominated by his father, William Billy McInerney. Billy was a tragic and terrifying figure in Brandon's life. He was a heavy drinker and a drug addict with a volatile temper. Domestic violence was not an occasional occurrence in the McInerney home, it was the baseline atmosphere. Perhaps the most shocking detail of Brandon's childhood occurred when his father, in a drug fueled rage, shot Brandon's mother, Kendra, in the arm. Brandon was young and witnessed the aftermath of this violence. Brandon learned from a very young age that conflict is resolved through physical dominance and weapons. He watched his father beat his mother and threaten others. He didn't just witness the violence, he was steeped in it. In one documented police report, Brandon's father, Billy, choked Brandon's mother, Kendra, almost to the point of unconsciousness because she accused him of stealing her son's ADHD medication. Brandon grew up watching this specific level of lethality. There are also reports that Billy would physically strike Brandon to quote unquote toughen him up, instilling the belief that physical pain was a teaching tool. Brandon's mother, Kendra, also struggled with drug addiction, specifically methamphetamine, and was often unable to protect Brandon or his siblings from Billy's rage. Eventually, the parents separated, but the trauma had already been inflicted. Psychologically, children from chaotic homes often crave rigid structure to feel safe. Brandon found this in the Young Marines. He joined the youth program and excelled in it. He liked the uniforms, the discipline, and the clear rules. It was the antithesis of his chaos at home. Tragically, shortly before the shooting, Brandon was kicked out of the Young Marines program. Because he was kicked out, his father was furious in the days leading up to the shooting. His father threatened to send him to a strict military boarding school or a boot camp as punishment. The Young Marines was the only place in his life where he had a positive role model, clear rules, and a sense of self worth that wasn't based on hate. It was his anchor in the chaotic storm. Like we said, when he was kicked out, reportedly this is for drug use or disciplinary issues, that anchor was cut. Suddenly, he was back in the chaos of his father's house 24/7 with no drill instructor to tell him what to do or to tell him that he was good. No structured future to look forward to. He was stripped of his identity as a Marine and left with his identity as a skinhead. He was not just a bully, he was being indoctrinated into white supremacist and neo Nazi ideology. The primary conduit for this ideology was reportedly his older half brother, who had served time in juvenile justice system and then also later in the Marines. His brother was older and had connections to the skinhead subculture in Oxnard, and Brandon idolized them. A detail from the investigation revealed that 2 nights before the shooting, Brandon didn't sleep at home. He stayed at the house of a known local white supremacist. This suggests that in the critical 48 hours before he pulled the trigger, he was directly in an environment that reinforced his hate based ideologies. Police found what they described as a trove of white supremacist materials in Brandon's bedroom and personal effects. This went far beyond casual interests. Brandon had filled notebooks with drawings of SWAT stickers and Nazi iconography. Investigators found an Iron Cross, which is a German military decoration often co opted for hate groups, in his room. He possessed books about Hitler's youth and materials related to white power ideology. This ideology gave him a framework for his anger. It taught him that masculinity meant dominance and that anyone that was different was inferior and a threat to the social order. White supremacist ideology generally views homosexuality not just as gross, but as a threat to the white race and a sign of social degradacy. When Larry flirted with Brandon, it wasn't just an awkward social moment. In the warped worldview Brandon was absorbing, Larry was an abomination who was insulting Brandon's honor. The ideology gave Brandon the moral permission to react with lethal force. It's impossible to tell the story without discussing the gun. Unlike many school shooters who have to go to great lengths to acquire a weapon, Brandon had easy access. His father, despite his history of violence and domestic abuse, kept unsecured firearms in the house. The gun itself was a 22 caliber revolver, and Brandon knew how to use it. His father had taken him shooting. In Brandon's world, guns were normal household objects, not forbidden items. By the time he reached E.O. Green Junior High, Brandon had constructed a very specific mask to hide his trauma. He was the tough guy. He was popular in a fearful way. He was a good athlete. He participated in football and wrestling. He projected an image of hyper masculinity. When you understand Brandon's background, the neo Nazi influences, the desperate need to prove his manliness to overcome his father's abuse, you can see why Larry was his perfect foil. Larry represented everything Brandon was taught to hate: femininity in men, weakness, and nonconformity. When Larry flirted with him, it wasn't just annoying. To a boy raised in a violent, homophobic, white supremacist culture, it was a threat to his very survival and status. One of the most interesting aspects of this case is how differently adults and students saw Brandon. By teachers, Brandon was often described as polite, engaging, charming. He was known to say yes, sir, no, ma'am, likely from his young Marines training. He was a good student who didn't cause disruptions in class. To the students, he was a bully and an enforcer. He was known to intimidate other kids, but he did it quietly, away from the teacher's eyes. This explains why the school administration was caught off guard. Larry was the proud problem in their eyes, while Brandon was the actual lethal threat. He was flying under the radar as the good boy. Despite having abusive, addicted parents, Brandon was often forced to take on the role of the adult in his house. With his mother in rehab or struggling with addiction, and his father often high or drunk, Brandon was frequently responsible for caring for his younger siblings. He had to make sure they were fed and safe. This forced maturity creates a deep resentment and a rigid need for control. When a child has to be the man of the house at 13 or 14, they often develop a brittle, defensive masculinity. They can't afford to be soft because their survival depends on being tough. A detail that adds complexity is why Brandon was living with his father at the time of the shooting. Brandon had the option to live with his mother, who was more stable at this period, or his father, who was actively spiraling. Brandon chose his father. Reports suggest he chose the father not because it was safer, but because there was less supervision. His father let him stay out, didn't check his homework, and allowed him more freedom. It highlights a tragic teenage calculation. He traded safety for freedom, but that freedom meant living in a house with unsecured guns and violent neo Nazi influences. We just spent a lot of time talking about the nightmare that Brandon McInerney went home to every night: the abuse, the drugs, the neo Nazi indoctrination. It's ugly and it's tragic. And as human beings, we can have empathy for a child living in that environment. But we have to draw a very hard lying in the sand right now. Understanding why a bomb was built doesn't change the fact that it destroyed an innocent life. Brennan's background explains his rage. It explains his access to weapons. It explains why he viewed the world through the lens of violence. But it does not excuse the execution of an unarmed 15-year-old boy in a computer lab. Now let's talk about the school itself, the third character in the story. It was located in Oxnard, California, which is a coastal city north of Los Angeles. In 2008, the school served roughly 1,000 students in grades 6 through 8. The student body was predominantly Hispanic and Latino, over 80%, with smaller populations of white, black, and Asian students. By most accounts, it was a typical crowded American junior high. It was loud and clique driven. However, retrospectively, accounts describe a rigid quote unquote boy code regarding masculinity. Deviating from the norm, whether you were a jock, a skater, or a gangster, was socially dangerous. The leadership of the school became a central point of contention after the murder. Dawn was the English teacher in the room when Larry was shot. She's a complex, tragic figure in this story. She was one of the few adults who actually affirmed Larry. She famously gave him a green dress that belonged to her own daughter, telling him he could wear it outside of school. During the trial, the defense used this against her, arguing she encouraged the behavior that got him killed. She was painted by someone that was supposed to be professional and crossing professional boundaries, while others saw her only as the adult that was showing him kindness. She witnessed the execution of her student. She eventually left the school and has struggled with PTSD. Some of the key areas in the school that we talk about are the quad slash cafeteria. This is an outdoor lunch area where the Valentine's incident happened. It was a public space where Larry asked Brandon to be his Valentine in front of others. There was no place for Brandon to hide his shame here. Then there's the locker room. This was the most dangerous place for Larry. It was unsupervised territory where verbal bullying turned physical. Then there's his sanctuary, the girls' bathroom. As mentioned before, this was the one safe zone where Larry could exist without fear, reinforcing the gender divide he was navigating. Larry was not a simple figure at the school. He wasn't just a quiet victim in the corner. He was loud, vibrant, and a polarizing presence. To a specific group of female students, Larry was a confidant and a source of fun. They loved his confidence. He would critique their outfits, give them relationship advice, and gossip with them. In the girls' bathroom or at the lunch tables, he was a celebrity. To many of the boys, Larry was confusing and infuriating. He didn't follow the script. If they bullied him, he didn't cry. He sassed them back. He would chase the boys who ran away from him. This earned him a reputation not as just the gay kid, but as someone who was looking for trouble or doing too much. Because Larry was loud and visually distinct, many students, even those who weren't bullies, viewed his behavior as purely attention seeking. They didn't understand the gender dysphoria or the trauma. They just saw a kid who always had to be the center of the show. But the teachers, they were exhausted. Larry required constant management. He would sing loudly in class, wander around, or shout out answers. He brought the drama of the hallway into the classroom. Teachers like Don saw the pain behind the behavior. They saw a brilliant, creative kid who was drowning. They tried to give him space to be himself. Other teachers felt he was a disruption to the learning environment. There was a sentiment among some of the staff that Larry was allowed to get away with murder, metaphorically speaking, regarding the dress code and his behavior, while other kids were punished. This created a subtle resentment that perhaps blinded them to the danger he was in. If Larry was the squeaky wheel, Brandon was the well oiled machine that nobody thought to check. Brandon was at the top of the social food chain. He was good looking, athletic, and funny. Being friend with him carried status. Everyone knew there was a dark side. There was a silent understanding that you didn't cross Brandon. He had a reputation for getting into fights, but usually winning them. He was the kind of boy other boys wanted to impress to ensure their own safety. Interestingly, within his own clique, he was saw as a loyal friend. The loyalty is partly why his friends didn't snitch on him. They felt he had their back, so they had his. This is the most dangerous perception. Because of his young Marine's training, Brandon knew how to speak to adults. He said, "Yes, ma'am," and "No, sir." He made eye contact. Some teachers knew about his rough home life. When they saw him behaving well in school, they viewed it as a success story. They thought, "Look at Brandon, overcoming the bad dad to be a respectful young man." Because he was polite to them, teachers assumed he was a good kid overall. They didn't see the neo Nazi drawings or the bullying because Brandon was smart enough to keep that behavior strictly in the student only zones. Before the murder, the general consensus on the Larry Brandon dynamic was dismissal. When students saw Larry flirting and Brandon getting mad, they didn't see a hate crime in the making. They saw a sitcom plot. It was entertainment. Oh, look, Larry's messing with Brandon. The biggest failure in perception was the idea that the conflict was mutual. Teachers and students alike often felt like Larry gave it as good as he got. Because Larry would shout back or flirt back, the school perceived it as two kids beefing rather than a predator hunting its prey. The false equivalency is why nobody intervened. They thought if Larry didn't want trouble, he shouldn't have blown that kiss. To understand the tragedy, you have to understand the specific cat and mouse dynamic that developed between them. It wasn't just that Brandon bullied Larry, it was that Larry, emboldened by his new identity, refused to submit to the bullying in the way that Brandon expected. In weeks prior to the shooting, the interactions changed. Usually, when the tough guy bullies an outcast, the outcast shrinks away or cries. Larry stopped doing that. Instead, Larry began using what psychologists and observers later called weaponized flirtation. When Brandon or his friends would mock Larry for being gay, Larry wouldn't deny it. He would lean into it. He would blow them a kiss. He would say, "I know you want me." This was a brilliant but dangerous survival strategy. It stripped the bullies of their power. They wanted fear. Larry gave them affection. For Brandon, who was steeped in homophobic and neo Nazi ideology, this wasn't just annoying, it was chemically explosive. He didn't know how to handle a victim who hit back with love letters instead of fists. This is the single most critical interaction. It's the moment the fuse was lit. Location, the crowded school quad during lunch. Larry walked up to the table where Brandon was sitting with the cool kids, the football players, and popular girls. In full view of the school's hierarchy, Larry reportedly asked Brandon, "Will you be my Valentine?" Witnesses described him as looking furious and mortified. He felt publicly owned by the person he viewed as lowest on the totem pole. Brandon's friends immediately pounced. They started brutally riding him. "Oh, look, there's your girlfriend. He loves you, Brandon." Before this moment, Larry was just a nuisance to Brandon. After this moment, Larry was a threat to Brandon's social survival. Following the cafeteria incident, the interactions didn't cool down, they heated up. In the corridors between classes, witnesses reported another interaction. As Brandon walked by with his friends, Larry reportedly shouted, "Love you, Brandon," or "Bye, baby," likely to get under his skin. A power move. On February 11th, the day before the murder, the direct interactions between the boys actually decreased, but Brandon's fixation on Larry peaked. In the psychology of school shootings, perpetrators rarely snap. They almost always leak their intent. Brandon leaked his intent clearly and repeatedly, but the recipients of that information didn't decode it correctly. The most chilling warning was delivered to Lydia, one of Larry's closest friends. On the day before the shooting, Brandon reportedly told her, "Say goodbye to your friend Larry because you're not going to see him after tomorrow." Lydia later recounted that she thought he meant he was going to beat Larry up or maybe get him suspended. In the mind of a 13-year-old girl, "You won't see him" translates to "he'll be absent," not that he'll be in the morgue. At lunch on February 11th, Brandon told a group of boys at his table that he was going to bring a gun to school. One student later testified he said he was going to bring a gun to school, but I didn't think he was serious. They viewed it as trash talk, a boy trying to sound tough in front of his crew. Brandon actually asked friends, "Will you help me jump him?" When they said no, he reportedly muttered something to the effect of, "Fine, I'll handle it myself." The friends thought the rejection ended the threat. They didn't realize it was merely escalating the tactic from fists to firearms. So, why did dozens of kids who heard rumors or direct threats say nothing? It wasn't malice, it was a mix of cultural conditioning and adolescent brain development. Teenagers use violent language casually. I'm going to kill him. I wish she was dead. I'm going to end him. These are common phrases in junior high hallways. These students heard Brandon's threat through his filter of exaggeration. They assumed he was venting, not planning. In the specific socioeconomic and cultural environment of that school in Oxnard, snitching was a cardinal sin. Reporting Brandon to the principal would have made the witness a social pariah. The immediate social fear of that outweighed the hypothetical physical danger. If the weird, quiet loner kid in a trench coat makes a threat, the kids might report it. But Brandon, he was a jock. He was popular. He was normal. The students suffered from normalcy bias. Popular football players don't shoot people, they shove them in lockers. They couldn't reconcile that the persona they knew was actually just an act and was threatened. The school administration has been heavily criticized, but legally, their defense was that they were operating in a vacuum. Not a single student reported the gun threat to a teacher, administrator, or parent before the shooting. The wall of silence, it held firm. The school knew there was tension between Larry and Brandon, but they had zero intelligence regarding a lethal threat. The administration viewed the Larry Brandon situation as a mutual conflict or drama. They saw Larry as an instigator due to the flirting and shouting, and Brandon as the reactor. They were treating it as a disciplinary issue to be managed with detention or talks, not a security threat involving police. Even if they suspected Brandon was angry, they couldn't search his backpack without reasonable suspicion. Because no one reported the gun, they had no legal grounds to stop him at the door or search his bag on the morning of February 12th. Now we get to the day of the murder. So let's break it down. We'll break down the timeline. The tragedy is the normalcy, by all accounts, that began as a typical day in Oxnard. Let's start with Larry's morning. Larry got ready at the Casa Pacifica group home. He put on his school uniform, but as usual, he accessorized. He wore his makeup and his signature brown knee high suede boots. He was reportedly in good spirits. At the McInerney house, Brandon prepared for school with a dark purpose. He went into his father's unsecured gun cabinet. He took a 22 caliber snub-nosed revolver out. He loaded it. He placed that handgun into his backpack, likely wrapped in a sweatshirt or buried under books. Both boys headed for EO Green Junior High. Larry likely taking the bus or a van from the group home. Brandon walking or getting a ride. They were converging on the same location. One expecting a school day, the other planning an execution. 8 a.m. to 8:15 a.m. The arrival at school. EO Green, like most junior highs in 2008, didn't have metal detectors. Brandon walked onto campus, greeted his friends, and walked through the hallways with a loaded firearm on his back. Students were milling about, going to the lockers. Hallway chatter was normal. If Brandon was nervous, he was hiding it well. He maintained his cool jock persona. 8:15 a.m. The bell rang for the first period. This was English class 8, taught by Don. On this specific day, the class was not meeting in their usual room. They were meeting in room 42, the school's computer lab, to type up some research papers. The lab was filled with rows of desktop computers. This detail is crucial. The students took their assigned seats. Larry sat in the front row. Brandon sat in the row directly behind him. There was less than 3 feet of distance. 8:15 to 8:35 a.m. For roughly 20 minutes, the class proceeded normally. Students were logging in, opening their Word documents, and typing. The room was filled with rhythmic click-clack of keyboards. Brandon sat there. He likely didn't do any work. He was staring at the back of Larry's heads. Accounts vary, but some reports suggest Larry might have turned around once to say something or to check the clock, or perhaps he was typing. But his presence, his boots, his hair, his existence was right in Brandon's face. Approximately 8:35 a.m. The violence was sudden, silent, and efficient. Brandon didn't scream. He didn't shout a slur. He didn't shove Larry. He simply stood up from his chair. He pulled out that snub-nosed revolver from his backpack. He extended his arm. He aimed it at the back of Larry's head. Brandon fired 2 shots in rapid succession. Bam, bam. Larry reportedly started to turn his head at the sound or the motion, but he was struck instantly. He slumped forward onto the keyboard and then slid to the floor. The silence of the computer lab shattered. For a split second, students didn't know what had happened. Someone thought a computer monitor had exploded or a firecracker had gone off. Then came the screaming. Students realized there was a gun. They dove under desks. They scrambled towards the corners of the room. Dawn screamed at Brandon, "What have you done?" She rushed towards Larry, who was bleeding heavily on the floor. Brandon's behavior immediately after the shooting was chillingly calm. He didn't threaten anyone else. He threw the smoking gun onto the classroom floor. He turned and walked out the door. He didn't sprint frantically. He strode out. Once outside the classroom, he began to run. He fled the school campus, heading towards a nearby park. 8:45 a.m. The manhunt was short-lived. Police were dispatched immediately to shots fired at the school. Police spotted Brandon roughly 5 blocks away from the school. He was apprehended without a shootout. He was arrested and taken into custody. When police searched him, the gun was gone. Obviously, he left it on the floor, but the intent was clear. 9 a.m. Larry was rushed by ambulance to St. John's Regional Medical Center. He arrived in critical condition. The bullets had caused catastrophic brain injury. And now we're going to go through the rest of Tuesday and lead up to Valentine's Day. While Brandon was in the police interrogation room, Larry was fighting a battle he had already lost. EO Green went into lockdown. Parents rushed to the gates. There was mass confusion. Rumors flew that it was gang related or a random shooter. It took hours for the truth to trickle out. It was Brandon. It was Larry. Larry was in the ICU. The doctors worked desperately to assess the damage, but the news was devastating. The bullets had entered the back of his head and caused catastrophic, irreversible brain trauma. By that afternoon, the doctors informed Larry's family, the Kings, and the confidentiality of the medical team cracked enough for the news to reach the public. Larry was brain dead. Technically, the person known as Larry was gone. Meanwhile, the police described Brandon as eerily calm. He didn't seem to grasp the magnitude of what he had done. Or perhaps he simply didn't care. He wanted to talk to his father. Wednesday, February 13th. This was the in-between day, the day of silence. Larry remained hooked up to the ventilators. His chest was rising and falling. His heart was beating, but only because the machines were forcing it to. Why the wait? The decision was made to keep his body functioning to preserve his organs. Larry was going to be a donor. This required time to find matches and prepare recipients. Outside the hospital at the school, the reality set in. Students started creating makeshift memorials. The why began to circulate. The story of the Valentine request started to hit the local news, framing the tragedy in a heartbreaking new light. On this day, prosecutors were already working. They decided, despite being 14, Brandon would be charged as an adult. The charge was initially attempted murder, but everyone knew it would be upgraded within hours. February 14th, Valentine's Day. The date arrived. The day Larry had asked Brandon to be part of became the day that Larry left this world. Everywhere in Oxnard, people were exchanging cards, buying flowers, and going to dinner. The world was celebrating love. In a hospital room, Larry's family, Don and Gregory King, the foster parents who wanted to adopt him, said their final goodbyes. They stood by the bed of a 15-year-old boy who should have been at school eating candy hearts. I'm sorry. 1:15 p.m. on Valentine's Day, Larry King was officially removed from life support. His heart stopped beating. Larry's heart went to a young girl in need of a transplant. Other organs saved multiple other lives. Even in death, Larry was giving. The heart that Brandon McInerney stopped was literally given to someone else to keep. Immediately following the pronouncement of death, the Ventura County District Attorney upgraded the charges against Brandon to first-degree murder with a hate crime enhancement. That evening, the news broke. The boy shot on Tuesday had died on Valentine's Day. The symbolism was too poignant to ignore. It galvanized the LGBTQ plus community and horrified the nation. Vigils turned from praise for Larry to justice for Larry. This is a cruel irony in the calendar. Larry King was shot because he wanted a Valentine, and he died on Valentine's Day. Immediately after the arrest, the Ventura County District Attorney Greg Totten made a controversial decision that set the tone for everything else that followed. Like we said, prosecutors decided to charge 14-year-old Brandon McInerney as an adult. First degree murder, implying it was willful, deliberate, and premeditated. Alleging that the crime was motivated specifically by the victim's sexual orientation, the hate crime enhancement was added on. Lying in wait, a special circumstance alleging Brandon hid his intent to take Larry by surprise. If convicted as an adult, Brandon faced 50 years to life in prison. If trialed as a juvenile, he could be only held until the age of 25. The prosecution argued that the execution style nature of the crime demanded adult consequences. And then we move on to the trial. The trial did not begin until 3 years after the murder. By then, Brandon was 17. The defense team, led by attorney Scott Whippert, launched a brutal strategy. The prosecution's case was the cold blooded argument. The prosecution kept it simple. Brandon brought a gun to school. He told friends he was going to kill Larry. He sat behind him for 20 minutes. He shot him in the back of the head. This was a calculated hate crime. The defense's case was the gay panic strategy. And if you don't know what that is, it's a very, very weak and pathetic excuse strategy for defense when they don't have any other defense. Like we said, the defense could not deny the shooting, so they put the victim on trial. They used the modern version of the gay panic defense. They argued that Brennan did not plan to kill Larry out of hate, but he rather snapped emotionally due to the unrelenting sexual harassment. They painted Larry as the aggressor. They called students to testify that Larry flirted with Brandon, blowing him kisses and saying, "I love you." They argued this was a form of bullying that humiliated Brandon to the point of breaking. They argued that Assistant Principal Joy Epstein and the administration failed to stop Larry's behavior, leaving Brandon trapped with no other choice but to act. So pathetic, very pathetic, and victim blaming. The defense was also successfully able to minimize the neo Nazi evidence, arguing Brandon was just a confused kid interested in history, not a hardened hate criminal. Then we get to September 1st, 2011, and it's the hung jury result, the result that shocked the LGBTQ plus community and legal experts. It was a deadlock. The jury could not reach a verdict. It was split. The vote was 7-5. Seven jurors, this is disgusting. Seven jurors voted for voluntary manslaughter, believing that Brandon was provoked. Five jurors voted for first degree or second degree murder. The meaning is the majority of the jury accepted the premise that a 14-year-old boy in high heels asking a classmate to be his Valentine was a significant provocation to mitigate an execution down to manslaughter. Then we get to November 2011. Faced with the prospect of a second trial that would be costly, traumatic for the witnesses, and an uncertain outcome, the district attorney's office sought a compromise, a plea deal. Brandon McInerney agreed to the plea, and the charges were dropping the first degree charge and acknowledging the heat of passion element and moving it to voluntary manslaughter. Use of a firearm enhancement was added, and the sentence agreement was a fixed 21 years in prison. Crucially, because of this, fuck, re-record. Crucially, because of the specific charges, he would receive no credit for the nearly 4 years he had already spent in juvenile hall. His 21-year clock started at zero. December 19th, 2011. The sentencing hearing was emotional and final. Brandon was now 17 years old. Judge Charles Campbell sentenced him to the agreed 21 years. Reports describe him as stoic. He didn't offer a tearful apology. Greg King, Larry's dad, spoke about the hole that was left in their lives. Don King, Larry's mom, addressed Brandon directly, saying, "You left a hole in my heart that will never heal." The English teacher, Dawn, she spoke about the trauma of witnessing the murder and the guilt that she carried, but she also expressed a complicated forgiveness. So where is Brandon now? Brandon McInerney is currently serving his sentence. With the 21-year sentence starting in 2011, Brandon McInerney is expected to be released around 2032, depending on conduct and parole laws. Though his sentence was largely fixed, he will be released when he's relatively young, in his early 40s. The most disturbing part of the trial wasn't the evidence, it was the strategy. In 2011, a defense team stood up in California courtroom and effectively argued that Larry King was responsible for his own murder because he was too loud, too proud, too gay. And the terrifying part, it worked. 7 jurors bought it. They looked at a dead 15-year-old and saw a bully, and they looked at a boy holding a smoking gun and saw a victim. 21 years. That's the mathematical value of the legal system placed on Larry King's life. It wasn't life in prison. It wasn't 50 years. It was 21. Brandon entered prison as a teenager and will leave as a middle aged man with decades of his life left to live. Larry never made it to 16. While the legal system was deciding Brandon's fate, the murder of Larry King set off a massive chain reaction in legislation, media, and the personal lives of those involved. Here's some of the detailed aftermath. Larry's death exposed a massive gap in California law. Schools were legally required to protect students from discrimination, but they had no specific mandate on how to handle bullying based on gender identity. Larry's Law. In the immediate wake of the shooting, Assemblymember Mike Eng introduced a bill often referred to as Larry's Law. It was designed to ensure that schools specifically addressed hate motivated harassment. Then there's a connection to another bill, Seth's Law. While Larry's death started the conversation, it was the suicide of another bully gay teen, Seth Welsh, in 2010 that pushed the comprehensive Seth's Law across the finish line in 2011. Because of these cases, California schools are now required to have specific publicized anti bullying policies that explicitly include gender identity and expression. The confusion that paralyzed the administration at Yale Green is now much clearer in the legal code. And then we get to one of the messiest aspects of the aftermath. There was a civil lawsuit filed by Larry's family, the Kings, against the school district. It revealed a heartbreaking conflict. The family's argument, Larry's parents, argued that the school was negligent. However, their argument was controversial. They claimed that the school failed to protect Larry by allowing him to wear his feminine clothing. They argued that Assistant Principal Joy Epstein should have enforced the dress code more strictly to protect him from himself. The school argued that under California state law, they could not legally force Larry to dress like a boy. They argued that stopping him would have been a violation of his civil rights. The school district eventually settled for a reported $270,000. It wasn't an admission of guilt, but it closed a painful chapter where the victim's freedom of expression was effectively on trial. In 2008 and 2010, the media coverage was often sympathetic, but one specific piece of journalism caused an outrage. Newsweek published a piece titled Young, Gay, and Murdered by Ramin Sudith. This article was heavily criticized by LGBTQ plus advocates for seemingly blaming Larry for his own death. It framed his behavior as too aggressive, and he asked for it. He had pushed Brandon too far. This article stands as a historical artifact of where society was in 2008. Even in mainstream media, this was a serious debate about whether a murdered victim was too gay for his own safety. In April 2008, just 2 months after the murder, the National Day of Silence was specifically dedicated to the memory of Lawrence Larry King. Thousands of students across the U.S. remained silent for the entire school day to honor him. They turned Larry from a local victim into a national martyr. As we said before, Brandon McInerney is currently incarcerated in the California state prison system. Because he received no credit for his time in juvenile hall, his 21-year clock has started ticking in 2011. He's expected to be released around 2032. He will be roughly 38 years old. He has spent his entire young adulthood behind bars, and reports on his time inside are sparse, which is typical for high-profile inmates seeking to survive in prison. The bullets stopped flying on February 12th, but the shockwaves never really stopped. The case forced California to rewrite laws. It forced schools to ask hard questions about the line between dress code and civil rights. And it forced the community to look in the mirror and ask if they were mourning a victim or blaming him. While Larry King lies in a grave and Brandon McInerney sits in a cell waiting for 2032, the rest of us are left living in a world where their tragedy helped build. a world that is hopefully a little safer for the next kid who wants to wear high heels to first period. We're going to end it there for today. As we approach the anniversary of this tragedy on February 12th and 14th, let's keep Larry's memory alive by being a little kinder to the people around us who are fighting battles we can't see. If you really like this episode, please follow the show and leave a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It really helps us out. You can also catch me on the socials. Instagram's my main hub. You can catch me there at Homicidal Tendency. You can also find me on Reddit. You can find me on Blue Sky. And you can find me on Twitter/X. You'll find behind the scenes photos, photos from the cases, and some random appearances by my two cats. Stay safe. Happy Valentine's Day. And I'll see you in the next one.